Thank you all very much for joining us this morning. I think we're all here. And I'd like to welcome you to today's event, which is part of the continuing series of the Greenwich Roundtable. Our topic this morning, healthcare investing in the era of big data, or as some say, polygenomics, is a continuation of two sessions we've had. The first was 20 years ago with Craig Venter in this room after he had finished mapping the Drosophilus genome. And the second was Brian Feurtado's earthquaking session 5 years ago on big data. And today our speakers are the very, very best in their weight class, so we look forward to hearing them. And I will briefly introduce them after I say this. The speakers' views are their own and don't necessarily represent our views. So having gotten that out of the way, I'll introduce them alphabetically. Colin Byrne is a founder and partner at 2 Sigma Ventures, a New York-based venture capital partnership. His primary qualifications include an obsession with technology and gadgets, avoiding coding whenever possible, and working on the business side of technology companies. And before joining 2 Sigma in 2005, Colin was a technology investment banker and strategist. Before that, Colin spent many a summer working at DoubleClick and many internships at San Francisco startups in the late 1990s. Sitting next to Colin, Dr. Greg Critchfield is the chairman and CEO of Zecher Prognostics, which is an innovative diagnostic testing company based in Salt Lake City. Zecher's tests are designed to predict the risk of complications in pregnancy. Before Zecher, Dr. Critchfield was president of Myriad Genetics Laboratories, where they launched 7 novel molecular diagnostic products that grew in revenue from $2 million to $360 million. Before that, he was chief medical officer at Quest Diagnostics. And finally, Dr. Charles Kennedy is a managing partner of Blue Ox, a private equity partnership based in New York, focusing on growth stage healthcare companies. Dr. Kennedy leads that firm's strategy and serves on its investment committee, as well as leading the firm's overall strategic focus. Before that, Charles was CEO of Aetna's Accountable Care Solutions division, growing it to a multi-billion-dollar company. Before his work in healthcare IT began, Charles was a practicing physician. And today, moderating the Greenwich Roundtable today is Dr. Phil Zecher. He's the Chief Investment Officer of Michigan State University and chairman of our programming committee here, which is the equivalent of our investment committee. So please welcome Phil as he sets the table for us today.
Thank you, Steve. First, I want to start with a public service announcement. As you heard, there are 3 doctors up here on the dais this morning. But if you're feeling ill, I want to warn you that one of them is a physicist and no use to anyone. But another one is a pathologist, so if you open your eyes and he's standing over you, it's not looking good for you. So choose carefully. Healthcare makes up about 1/5 of the GDP. Healthcare spending makes up about 1/5 of our national GDP. If you are, whether you directly invest or indirectly, it's going to be part of your portfolio. It's part of all of our lives. But despite the size and importance of healthcare in investing and in the economy, I'll have to say it's not necessarily been everyone's favorite asset class. Since 2000, when the genome was first sequenced and when Mr. Venter was here, there's been been this promise of great discoveries, customized drugs and treatments, general revolutions in healthcare, but a lot of those seem to not have panned out in time. And why is that? One, I think, is that just science doesn't necessarily play nice with the typical time frames of venture capital and private equity companies. It can just take a long time. Also, these were big bets in a lot of cases and with binary outcomes. Also, massive and expensive regulatory hurdles that are out there. And importantly, a complex, and some would say broken system of paying for healthcare, and which makes trying to capitalize on the value creation that happens in healthcare is difficult. This has led one colleague of mine recently at a CIO meeting to admonish the rest of us to just don't do drugs. But there's a lot more to healthcare than just drugs. with the advent of machine learning, big data, we might finally start seeing some of the rewards coming from the sequencing of the genome and that line of study. And so today we have got three panelists here going to approach healthcare from three different perspectives. First, we have Colin, who's going to explore this landscape from the venture side. And how does this big data, how do these advances in machine learning, how are these transforming what they're looking at? And then next we have Greg, who's coming at this from an operator's perspective, both with a very successful Myriad Genetics and now with Sarah. And then last, Charles is going to wrap up with not just only some thoughts on growth investing in this category or area, but also the important of how do you take something that's a novel therapy or a new invention and actually get rewarded for it economically when the client or the patient is not actually always paying the bill directly. So with that, I will turn it over to Colin.
Okay. Thank you, Phil. Thank you very much for having us here today. Really excited to talk about this topic, which is one that we spend a lot of time talking about at 2 Sigma Ventures. I also noticed how under-credentialed I am to be on the panel compared to everyone else, and I suppose that gives me the job. I think my job as an early stage investor here in general and here on this panel is to be the optimist, to present the view of the future that's really bright and optimistic and is acknowledging of the challenges, but we often think about how can the world, we look ahead as early stage venture capitalists, we look ahead and think about how could the world operate better? What is a future state that is better than the current state that we're excited about, and what set of things could go right to help us get there? I thought I'd spend a few minutes just talking initially about just giving a brief overview of 2 Sigma Ventures and what we do. Then I'll talk about why we're interested in healthcare and data, which is not perhaps a natural thing for us to be interested in. Talk about some of the things that I think have gone well since Craig Ventner sort of kicked off an industry, amongst others. And then talk about some of the things that we see as bright spots of the future and a few of the challenges, and then we'll turn it over to my colleagues. So 2 Sigma Ventures is an early stage venture capital fund that was started attached to 2 Sigma Investments about 7 years ago. We started the fund to take advantage of what we thought of as these two big breakthroughs that were happening in the world. One was this exponential increase in the amount of data and information that is being created across virtually every industry for all the reasons you can think of. And a second is this belief that we have that the science of computing, what machines are capable of doing, is on a continuing advance. And so we thought those two trends, those two big forces together, were going to come together to create breakthroughs in virtually every industry. 2 Sigma Investments, for those of you that know it, is a 19-year-old organization that is a quantitative or systematic investment manager. And it's almost like a case study to us at 2 Sigma Ventures, right? 2 Sigma's founders had this theory that you could use data and computing to make better investment decisions and train models to make investment decisions that don't have the same kind of human biases that our brains exhibit, et cetera. And 18 or 19 years later, that's been a pretty successful strategy for 2 Sigma and others. And we see that as a case study that take that in financial services or investment management and expand it to virtually every other industry. And we think there could be companies that are of the same ilk in those industries. We are, as I said, we started about 7 years ago. We've made investments in about 75 companies. We are investors across lots of different industries. So I'll obviously talk about healthcare a lot today, but we had this theory that we could be horizontal investors, so not focus vertically on any particular sector, but focus horizontally in the companies that are being most enabled by those trends around data and advanced technology and advanced computing. I want to say a minute about what early stage investing is. Many of you are investors in the room. Many of you probably make investments in venture capital. I imagine there's some people in the room who probably think venture capital is evil and we should stay away from it and it's a way to lose money. We believe as early stage investments in something called the power law, right? Which is we make 30 or 35 investments in a fund and we expect that something like a third, maybe even half of them will lose money. And that's natural for us and normal for us. Private equity folks can't imagine that state of the world, but but that's expected for us. And we do that because we think a lot of the returns will come from the things that we get right in those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 companies out of those 30 that ultimately drive fantastic returns. You know, the saying goes, you can only lose 1 time your money, but you can make 10 or 100 or 1,000 or 1,000,000 times your money in some cases. So in order to be a good early stage investor, what you have to be willing to do is take risk and be out of consensus. There's a box, sometimes people draw a sort of a 2x2 matrix, which is on one axis is whether something actually is a good idea or actually is a bad idea, which you can't really know in the beginning. And then the other axis is whether something looks like a good idea at the time you're investing or looks like a bad idea. And to keep the story short, the best quadrant is the things that look like a bad idea but actually are a good idea, because those are the things where you can get enormous returns. If it looks like a good idea and actually is a good idea, it probably should be fully priced and mean the market is relatively efficient and you can derive a return from that, but not a very big one. So for early stage investors, you have to make out of consensus bets that turn out to be right. Another investor sometimes calls it, you have to know something 3 years before the rest of the world actually realizes it. And so that's our job, is to figure out how can we make out of consensus bets and have a handful of them be really right every fund, every 30 or 35 funds. And that's what the best, every 30 or 35 companies, and that's what the best funds do well. So that leads us to being optimistic. We often talk not about what are all the ways a company can fail, because that's easy to do, frankly. Anyone can take a venture capital investment and say it's going to fail for this, and this reason. And in most cases, you're probably going to be right. But what you have to talk about is actually what are the set of circumstances that could go right that will make this into one of the most important companies in the world. And that's what we spend a lot of time talking about as early stage venture capitalists. So let me turn now to our thesis about healthcare. We had this thesis about data changing the world. We look horizontally. About 4 or 5 years ago, we looked at the healthcare market and we said, you know what, this is one of the purest expressions of this thesis, where data is really being recorded and created for the first time. Sort of really digital, searchable, usable by model kind of data is being created for the first time. We were just talking about all the challenges that creates, which we can also go into. But we looked and we said, you know what, these trends of applying data and computing to this industry is really impacting healthcare. And we thought that some of the very biggest, most important companies that are expressions of our thesis around data and computer science would be healthcare companies. So we started pretty gradually to invest in it. We knew of all of the sort of risks that are fraught in the healthcare space, so we did not immediately start trying to lead big investments there. We started actually investing in some funds, building a small team, and gradually started making seed investments in this space. It's actually the only industry vertical where we have a full-time dedicated member of our team who focuses only on that vertical, and that's because of all the challenges that we can talk about with that space. So we're still evolving as venture capital investors. We're still learning. We're still on a ramp towards being able to invest in a large portion of our capital in healthcare. But we do really feel like if I look ahead over the next 20 years, we think that this is probably one of the spaces that will drive the most return for investors like us. We're excited to learn more about it. So let me just spend a few minutes on things that have happened in recent history that we're excited about, and then I'll turn to things we're excited about looking forward. So I think there are many obvious challenges in healthcare innovation, right? We'll talk more, I'm sure, about the struggle with the spiraling cost and not getting the great outcomes that we might deserve for that spend. But I think there have been some tremendous strides in healthcare, since Venter and others. The first is EMRs. It's a small thing. Maybe it's not a small thing, but it's an obvious thing. But we all remember going to doctors and have them writing notes and illegible notes that you would not believe anyone could ever read that ever again after that day when it was written. I haven't been to a doctor who's written anything by hand in a while. So it's far from perfect, but at least the data, we call it turning on the tape recorder. Like, at least the tape recorder is on now. That data is getting created, and it's not getting created as well as it could, et cetera, but at least the tape recorder is on, and that digital data should live forever from now on. And my information should be able to train someone's model 100 years from now, one would hope. So we like that. We think that's great. We have an investment in a company called Carbon Health that's trying to recreate primary care in a very data-driven way. Another I wanted to mention is telehealth. I think that's a big, important development that's come out in the last 10 or 15 years. A lot of patients prefer it. It's a faster way to receive care in some cases. Certainly more flexible for physicians that want to practice that way. Enables other kinds of people to be physicians who might want to do it part-time or work from home, et cetera. I think those are good things. Robotic surgery is something that's excited me. Using AR in surgery is exciting. Especially you, Greg, will know perhaps more about this from a physician's perspective. But I think it's being less invasive, fewer errors, less collateral damage, a shorter recovery time. I think those things are all good, and I'm excited about the developments in that space. 3D printed prosthetics, especially for children, I think that's been an exciting space. Being able to print stents that are custom fit to people's particular biology. And then I think the last thing that's exciting for us is this strong consumer interest. This is maybe on the lower tech end, but strong consumer interest in the quantified self. It obviously started with Fitbit and just wanting to know how many steps I walked in a given day. But I think through the Apple Watch, which shows people their heart rate, and I'm actually wearing a device, one of our companies, it's called Whoop, which is measuring my heart rate variability. It told me I didn't sleep very well last night, and I'd struggle if I was trying to do athletic performance today. I think those kinds of things, being able to know more about our body, sort of interrogate our body and understand with advanced sensors what our body is going through, I think those are exciting trends. And then last, let me just turn to what we're excited about for the future, our outlook for healthcare. We're very excited about the application of AI in healthcare. It's obviously a big space, but I think many people have talked about the ability of AI to read images and identify and highlight problematic areas in images that then might serve up to a radiologist. People are, of course, worried that will AI just take those jobs? I think for a while this is going to be a mode of AI augmenting humans as a tool rather than taking over those jobs. Things like helping with dosing and drug interactions, mining EHR data, being a better scribe for a doctor. So hopefully someday the doctor won't have to just be staring at a computer and doing this, but can be speaking, or the smart AI can just be listening to the conversation rather than the doctor having to take the notes. I think that's exciting. Something that we've invested in is an understanding of the gut. So a lot of people have talked about microbiome. We also have a company called Calliope down the road in New York that's working on mapping the gut-brain axis. Sort of what do we know about the cells that interact between the gut and the brain, and what role do those cells play in things like satiety and overeating or cravings? And could you actually find drug compounds that would only target those gut cells and create the feeling of you're full, or you don't actually need that sugar rush that you think your brain wants, et cetera? We're excited about that company in that space. We think about food as medicine. That's a space we're starting to look at a lot. We all day long we're ingesting things into our body, and we don't exactly know how our bodies react to them. Of the 40 people in this room, that drink of orange juice might spike some people's blood sugar and other people's not at all. And we don't really know that about ourselves unless anecdotally we've figured that out. So I think there's going to be a future where we will all understand how certain foods impact our bodies. And I think there are companies now that are trying to create those studies and have a better understanding of that. Sleep is another factor. I talked about it earlier. I think getting data on how we sleep is exciting. It's a small thing, but I think many of us have realized, and a lot of the science is pointing to sleep as sort of the magic medicine for a lot of things at the moment. So I really think people will pay more attention to sleep. We're spending a lot of time looking at digiceuticals, so non-drug therapies, software-based therapies. We've seen a few of these start to get some traction. Smoking cessation. Combating alcoholism. Some of those things are starting to work if you have smart software that prompts you in the right ways. We're excited about that. Probably one of the biggest areas that we've spent time on is precision and personalized medicine, drug discovery related to that. I think that's one of the biggest trends that we're most bullish on. I think it does start with, everyone's seen the cost curve of genome sequencing coming down many, many orders of magnitude over the last few decades. Ventnor, I think the stat is it took 50%, 7 years to get to the first 50%, and then some people said, okay, so that means it's going to take an additional 7 years, but actually the exponential nature, it took an additional 1 year, I think, to get the last 50% of the genome sequenced. I might be slightly wrong on that. Other people will know that, will correct me. We're very excited about that. All the things related to targeted therapies, immunotherapy, understanding gene expression and the epigenome and the proteome. We have a company called Hexagon Therapeutics that's looking in the fungal DNA for targeted therapies and compounds that target cancer. Drug discovery is definitely hard, but we really think that, you mentioned biology having its limitations. That's definitely true. We have a number of companies that are aiming to parallelize and get much more high throughput data. So you can't slow down biology. You can't speed up biology, but what you can do is run, 1,000 times more experiments at the same time as you did previously. And we have a number of companies like Recursion Pharmaceuticals and In Citro and Terray that are working on that. Sort of how can you get a lot of data very fast? And I think that's exciting. Want to conclude. I think a few other areas. Fixing clinical trials, it's a big challenge at the moment, especially if all our platform drug companies are successful in identifying compounds faster, they're going to face a bottleneck at the clinical trial and recruitment and regulatory approval, et cetera. So we've got to solve that. We talked a little bit about bringing data together to train models. Maybe a last area I'll mention is regenerative medicine, sort of one of the biggest impact potential things that I think is really hard, and I don't think this is 5 years from now, although there are some companies that can print bone tissue, et cetera, but I think printing tissue, printing organs, printing replacement parts, if you will. We're close to Dean Kamen, the sort of renowned inventor who started something called the Advanced Regenerative Medicine Institute up in Manchester, New Hampshire. I think that's a longer timeline, but I think some of the things that they're working on are exciting. So I think all of this has been made possible by those two trends I started with in the beginning, by a sense of we have to get data and figure out how we can utilize it, and then we have to take advantage of the modern tools like AI, like machine learning, even like basic statistics and algorithms. I think all of these trends that we're excited about, we think are enabled by those things. There are definitely challenges. Life expectancy is declining. Drug addiction, weight-related complications, increasing rates of suicide, anxiety, and depression. A lot of these things are challenges that the healthcare market faces, but we are, as early-stage investors, we are optimists. We are believers in innovation and progress. I was just reading, I think it was in the National Geographic recently, I was reading this quote that I'll paraphrase. It's that these kinds of things should enable us to move from the episodic, disconnected, sick care that we've been doing in the past towards something that, and I like the terms they used, it said ever-present, analytics-enabled, real-time, individualized attention to our health and well-being to treat disease and prevent it. I just want to say that again because I love it. Ever-present, analytics-enabled, real-time, individualized attention. I think data and technology will enable us to have that, and we're really excited about the future. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Colin. We'll turn it over to Greg, who will now talk about how you actually take some of these discoveries and these processes and turn them into a company that has value for the investor.
Okay, it's a pleasure to be here. I love the look toward the future that Colin articulated. Clearly, this is all an embodiment of Moore's law. We've seen it. The ability to compute has actually led to huge advances in biology over the last several decades. And the Human Genome Project is only one example. There are many more that are happening right now. And so what I'd like to do, I thought it might be useful to just look at it from the viewpoint of somebody who's been involved in diagnostics and therapeutics and medical devices. I've served on 11 boards with different things being created. The experience I had at Myriad and actually first at Quest Diagnostics and at Myriad was really very informative for me as you think about problems that need to be solved in healthcare, and there are thousands and thousands of problems in healthcare. We all know how disconnected, how never present, how dysfunctional the medical system can be, but there are huge opportunities there also. So what I wanted to do is articulate 9 different points And by the way, I've shared this information with Steve. Maybe you may find these to be useful, but 9 points that help you as investors to identify what things are going to be valuable and what you need to look for. Where can you find opportunities? And it won't be, I won't be looking so much at trying to be 3 years ahead of the curve, although there is a lot of that here too. But what I want to do is give you some discrete ideas drawn from my experience in the past of things that have worked for me and worked for other people. I think one of the things you have to do is actually find a big problem where there's a huge unmet need. And it's really important that the problem be of sufficient magnitude that would warrant investment, it would warrant time and energy to really go after something that's going to change things. A lot of things in medicine are invented by technologists, people that they're technophiles. They love the way the science works and stuff. And then they say, well, maybe this could be used in this area. And it's sort of an accidental let's look around and see if this could work in something else. And that's not necessarily a bad strategy, but you don't always solve big problems by doing it that way. And looking fundamentally at big problems and what does it take to go after is part of it. When I was at Myriad, we were addressing the problem of hereditary cancer. Families that had huge incidence of disease over decades that were struggling because they had a high incidence of certain kinds of cancers. And those families became the subjects of studies to help discover the genes that actually caused hereditary cancers. And it was a big problem. And the beauty of going after it and getting a biological basis for it and then solving it and moving from that is even therapeutics today has been benefited by those discoveries that were made 2-3 decades ago. There are new approaches to therapies that actually use the defects in genes as ways of targeting cancer cells. So, something that people did not necessarily anticipate at the time. So a big problem is what you want to go after. With seroprognostics, the big problem we've been focusing on is that of preterm birth. In the U.S., the March of Dimes just released a report card a couple weeks ago. In the U.S., our preterm birth rate is more than 1 in 10. We're over 10% of pregnancies have the baby being delivered too early. Babies that are delivered very early have huge problems, both immediate and long-term. We spend $32 billion a year as a society treating complications of prematurity. This is a big problem. No one's made sufficient progress to change things. And the problem has been we didn't have the tools to identify women who are truly at risk. And the two best predictors we had of early delivery could only get about 1 in 5 patients. So we saw this as a big opportunity. If we could build a way of using biomarkers, using the biology and predicting who in fact is at risk, and then give them interventions that would make a difference, that could be game changing. And that's what the problem that we went after about 8 years ago when we began working on this problem. The second principle is this. In healthcare, the big problem you're trying to solve typically is big in terms of economics. You have to have huge economics that hinge on the unsolved problem. And if you're able to actually solve it, you significantly lower healthcare costs, and you do it by helping the patient. And so in our case, as I said before, $32 billion of expense. That number keeps going up. It's not going down at all. And even if the incidence of preterm birth were to stay the same, that cost will continue to go up because the technologies that are applied are expensive. There's a lot of things that we have to bear as a society. And by the way, those costs are underestimates of the real cost to society. The third thing is it's good to choose something that people actually care about. Now this may sound funny, but having something that people care about and really want to have solved is a good place to be putting bets down. And I'll talk in breast and ovarian cancer. women are always thought about breast cancer as something that they really wanted to avoid. People care about it deeply. And in our area, in the U.S., we all love mother and apple pie. And there's only one thing we love more than mother and apple pie, and that's mothers and babies. And so having something that is emotional, that people are connected to, can relate to, have experience with, if you're solving that kind of a problem, there's going to be a demand for it, and there will be recognition of value if you're able to actually solve the problem. So the caring about the problem is part of it. The fourth principle is that the technology that you're proposing to use has to work. There are a lot of people that come up with things, and the technology could only partially answer the question. You have to actually demonstrate the validity of the technology that you're doing, and that's actually a regulatory requirement in what we do. The term of art is clinical validity. You prove that what you have is valid in predicting or stating what the condition is of the patient that you're examining, and there are you really have to in the myriad days. We had to actually we had to use sequencing technologies to discover the genes, and then we had to show that by having that information, you were predicting the risk, and that these patients could benefit then by doing certain things with them earlier. And it comes back to this ever-present idea that Colin talked about. You want to be able to give information as early as you can to patients that allow them to modify their behavior, to modify the things that are done in the healthcare system to their benefit. And so in order to have that actually take place, the technology itself has to work. It has to be. You have to demonstrate validity, and there are ways that you do this. The next principle is this: is that the information itself has to be pivotal in decisions that are made. In other words, without it, people are not able to make certain decisions without that information, without the diagnostic evidence that you're giving them. They can't make decisions, and they go ahead and suffer the consequences of not having that information. If you have something valuable, and the information is valuable in changing what a doctor or patient would do with that information, then you've got something that's worthwhile. What would happen in our case with preterm delivery, if you knew the patient was at risk, you would educate her more about the signs and symptoms of problems in pregnancy. You would see her more frequently. You can give her prophylactic medications that actually change the way the baby, that actually help the baby to stay in utero longer. And if she has anything that happens, given that she has high risk, you would react much more promptly and more aggressively to benefit the health of the baby and or the mother. So those are some of the things that you think about in terms of the information being pivotal. Another principle is that you want to improve health, and by improving health, you actually improve the economics of healthcare. It's a win for everybody if you can do that. If you can make babies healthier, if you can actually lower the expense of taking care of infants that are born more maturely and in a better state of health, then everybody wins. And you're doing it by improving the health, and that's a winner whenever you can do it. The last thing, one of the last steps that's required in order to receive payment, and Charles will talk about this in his remarks too. You have to be able to demonstrate that what you're providing, it actually can improve. It has value in improving the health of patients and in economics. And what it typically means is you're involved in studies where you show your technology and you show the current standard of care without the technology, and you demonstrate that in fact people are better off and money is saved. And there are a lot of different ways of doing the clinical studies. Colin talked about the problems that we have in our field. It's oftentimes difficult to get patients to agree to certain therapies that you want to test. You have to do it in an ethical way. There are all kinds of rules about human subjects involved in research that you have to follow carefully. But the bottom line is, if you're able to demonstrate the clinical utility, and you're able to demonstrate in a relatively short period of time, that speeds your ability to get the product out, get it used, and get it reimbursed. The reimbursement becomes a key thing, and I'll mention it toward the end. The last thing is that the technology that you propose has to be scalable. It was great that Colin talked about the cost of sequencing. In the earliest days of Myriad, when I first joined the company, we were sequencing 1.5 million bases of DNA. It took us a year to do that. It was a year. And Myriad was one of the highest throughput labs in the world at that time. But it took us a year. By 2006, we were doing that in 2 hours and 28 minutes. And today, we've gone even beyond. To that point, that was a 4,300-fold improvement in throughput. And you can imagine, as the costs of sequencing, the costs of being able to look at things tumble, you're able to provide things in a very, very cost-effective way. In the area we're working in, we decided that we were going to use our understanding of biology as a way to find real solutions for real problems by looking at the result of DNA, RNA, and proteins. We looked at protein expression. And in those days, when we started, the tools of protein expression analysis, mass spectrometry, was just beginning to get to a point where it was sensitive enough, you could see things, you could reliably measure things. And we actually have pushed that limit, and we're looking at the ability now to do millions of tests with tens of mass specs, where we could do the entire U.S. population. There are 3.8 million women that are candidates for our test, but we have to have a way of scaling it so that the costs are low, so that people can afford it, and so that it will work. And so the scalability, the efficiency, and the cost is another factor you need to look at. Technologies are always expensive when you invent them. The first prototypes are incredibly expensive. Doing the studies is expensive, but over time, the provision of those data of that device has to be brought down in cost to where it can be democratized, and you really need to look for that. And then the last item is one that Charles will enlighten us on, and it's a very important aspect of it, and that is who is the customer. In our field, we have three customers. We have patients, we have physicians, and we have payers. Payers are the ones that actually are extremely important in that equation. And I believe that at the end of the day, you build these things so that payers will say, it is advantageous for me to cover this service because it makes a difference. And so whoever pays for it, I believe, is the ultimate customer whose needs you must satisfy. And in our world, third-party payment, I view that as a strategic imperative for us. Our vision is that we'll be a leader in women's health and high-value women's health diagnostics. We provide pivotal information to doctors so they change what they do, and as a result, we improve health and we improve the economics of healthcare delivery. By having coverage, that is how you achieve that vision. You have to have the coverage in order for people to receive the services that will in fact change the world if you have a life-improving and life-saving technology. So those are, at the end of the day, you ask the question, can the technology build value for individuals, for payers, and for society? And if you can answer yes to the great majority of these questions, you've got something that is worth taking a look at. Okay?
And I think that's a perfect segue into Charles.
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. You've heard from Colin this incredible wealth of innovation that could really improve our healthcare system. Greg has then walked you through kind of how a company might be built to bring those products to market. But there's a fundamental question, which is, are they worthy of investment? And when you think about creating a return from investing in these kinds of companies, all roads lead through the health plan. the vast majority of what these two gentlemen have talked about, if you can't get reimbursement from the health plan, your likelihood of getting a successful return as an investor is pretty low. There's been a few things that you can go directly to the consumer on, but in general, you've got to find a way to get health plans to cover it, be it the government or private payers. And I can tell you, I spent 15 years working for health plans, Anthem and Aetna, and I can tell you very frequently innovators like Greg would come to me and say, "Doggone it, I'm creating all this value. Why won't you guys cover my test? Why are you so cynical?" And let me give you a little framework about why health plans are quite cynical about the innovations that they see. And the first principle I'd offer you is there is a vast gulf between what the clinical research says and what happens in the real world. So clinical research might say all women should get a mammogram, and especially those who have had a previous history of breast cancer should get a mammogram on an annual basis. But when I used to run informatics for Anthem, and every time a woman got a mammogram, we would get a claim. So we had a pretty good repository to look at how that happened in the real world. And our data plus clinical research data showed that in the real world, up to 50% of women who have already had a surgical procedure for breast cancer fail to get mammograms the following year. Now that's kind of a stunner, but it's common. And so the first thing is there's a vast gulf between what you see in the research data, what you see in the real world data, and so I, as a health plan, when you come to me and say, I'm going to save you all this money, or I'm going to improve all these lives, I'm going to apply a very, very significant discount factor for that, because that's not what we see in the real world. To give you, so that was kind of an example on the patient side. What about on the provider side? Well, when I joined my first health plan way back in 1996-ish, one of the great innovations was to treat breast cancer. There was a belief that if we could just give the patients enough chemotherapy, that we could cure them from breast cancer. And the issue was, as you increase the dose of chemotherapy, you begin to get side effects. And one of the first side effects is you suppress the patient's bone marrow. So somebody came up with a great idea. We can take the bone marrow out of the patient. We can give them the high-dose chemotherapy, which basically wipes out their bone marrow, and give them their bone marrow back, thus hopefully curing the cancer. And I had just joined health plans when this controversy was happening. There was protests to the government. Health plans were forced to cover it. But when the real-world studies finally got done, what we found was that there was no survivability advantage, no quality of life advantage. And using 1990s dollars, we had spent, I think it was on the order of $3 billion for something that didn't benefit anyone. So those health plans bring that perspective to the table when they look at clinical innovation. Now you might say, well, gee, that sounds like kind of a rare thing. I would point you to the New York Times just last week. Had an article about a study presented to the American Heart Association that was looking at the performance of stents that we put in to people's coronary arteries when they have obstructions. We've been doing this for years and years and years, spending billions and billions of dollars, and yet the clinical research is showing more and more that in fact they have very little value except in very specific instances. The left anterior descending, otherwise known as the widowmaker artery, if you have a blockage there, then it makes sense to do a few other things. But for the vast majority of obstructions in coronary arteries, no benefit. So again, health plans, we read this stuff, and because once something gets approved for payment, it's almost impossible to pull it away. They bring a very, very cynical perspective. The other thing I'd say happening right now, we talked about precision medicine. Well, if you look at the precision medicines that are being deployed and how they're being used in the real world, some studies show that 50% of the time or more, the patient's not going to get any benefit from it because they don't have the right biology to take advantage of the very precise medicine. So again, health plans are really the only entity in the healthcare industry that is focused on those kinds of issues. And so they're not just being bad guys, there's a reason why they are hesitant to cover many of the innovations that many of us would like to see used more commonly. So given that background, Why on earth would I join a private equity firm that's healthcare focused exclusively? Well, one of the reasons is the healthcare industry is changing. And whether you're a government payer or whether you're a private payer, the big kind of buzzword in the industry right now is value-based incentives. And what value-based incentives basically means is traditionally we have paid physicians fee for service. You provide a service, you get a fee. More services, more fees. And there's been a recognition for decades that that's an inflationary way to go about it. And so what the industry has been trying to do is to change how they pay physicians so that the physicians who provide high quality care but do it in an efficient way make more money than the ones who, let's say, provide high quality care and do it in an inefficient way. And so what that has led to is a series of new payment models, things like bundled payments, where you don't just pay each person individually. I mean, if any of you have been to the hospital and you've got that huge charge bill that you get with all these line items, right? Think about aggregating that all together, putting it into a single payment and saying for the doctor, on average, you should be able to deliver this care for this procedure for this amount of money or less, and if you do it more efficiently, you'll make more money, right? With quality measures to make sure they're not skimping on care. That's what's happening in the industry right now, and that sets a financial framework for pretty dramatic industry change. And what I mean by that is, if I'm going to pay you based on value, you're going to have to change, you as a physician, what you do and how you do it, right? Well, what does that mean? That's a call for innovation, right? When I was actually at Aetna and I was in charge of their value-based strategy, and we could create the financial frameworks, we could create the innovations. Where the strategy fell apart was that the physicians, the hospitals, all the providers involved in the care of the patient, they didn't understand, what should I do differently? I would always have medical directors come and say, you know, we love the idea of being paid based on performance because we think we perform really well, but what do I actually do differently? And so there's a dramatic call for innovation out in the marketplace right now. If you look at Seema Verma, who's in charge of CMS, her speeches always include a component of, we have to find ways to make innovation more efficiently developed, more effective in the rollout, and more timely. So there's a strategic change in the industry that I think is going to drive a demand for more and more innovation. But the key capability and the key thing payers are going to be looking for is, number one, do you actually impact patient outcomes, right? It's great to innovate, but if you can't show me I can save this many babies, or I can reduce neonatal ICU use, or I can increase the gestational age of the baby so that they're healthier when they're born, if you can't show me any of that, I'm probably not going to pay for it. But if you can, I'm probably going to be one of your biggest allies. So this change to value-based incentives, I think, is really a sea change in the industry and represents a new opportunity for folks investing in innovation to get a return on their money. And just to give you an idea of some of the areas I think that are going to do really well in value-based incentives, the first one is quite frankly Greg's company. We invested in it because of that. Molecular diagnostics. Why will they do so well? Because at the end of the day, what Greg is providing to physicians and patients is information. He's assessing your risk, your individualized risk of whether you're going to deliver your baby preterm. Armed with that information, physicians can use evidence-based interventions that we already know work on high-risk women. We just couldn't figure out who the other high-risk women were. In fact, we call it spontaneous preterm birth because doctors don't see it coming. With his innovation, they now see it coming, they can intervene, and they can create superior outcomes. Well, that's powerful and I think replicable. So if you then take an innovation like that and you go to, let's say, New York, New York has applied for something called an 1115 waiver, which basically means all the Medicaid dollars they got, they have in their hands, and they can now use different ways to pay doctors at their discretion. So they've built a value-based incentive contract for providers taking care of pregnant women. Well, you can imagine taking an innovation like this impacting the preterm birth rate. Now you're addressing a $32 billion market opportunity that nobody's made any progress against. And with value-based incentives, remember, if you deliver the same care for less, you're making that money. Now you have an opportunity to very quickly begin to create a return for your investors, to drive revenue and drive profits. So again, that model, I think, is new. It's really, value-based care has only really been with us the past, say, 5 years or so, and its penetration in the marketplace is still quite low. But the payers are driving increased adoption of value-based strategies. So I think it's going to be the dominant strategy. I think molecular diagnostics are going to work quite well. Medical devices, some of the devices you were mentioning, those will have value-based impacts. And again, using this new strategy of taking, one company we looked at had a device which, in the case of diabetics, one of the biggest drivers is amputations. They get small vessel disease. Their arteries don't deliver the blood appropriately, and it is the leading cause of amputation. Well, we looked at one company that had a device that could take a picture of a limb and see the ulcer forming, the diabetic foot ulcer, before you could see anything clinically. Again, another example of you arm a doctor with information, they can intervene, create a superior outcome. That should be an innovation that creates a compelling return for their investors. Third area that's going to be necessary in value-based incentives is health IT infrastructure. Most of the health IT that's out there today, I call it electronic file cabinets. The systems were designed to help doctors bill better. So if I could document more, I could document the illness of the patient and bill at a higher level. That's not what you need in a value-based world. You need data so that you can run algorithms, run the types of things Colin was talking about, find the opportunities, and drive better value. The entire electronic medical record infrastructure that's out there today is not well suited for that. So we think there's opportunities in health IT infrastructures. And then lastly, consumer empowerment. Think about the fact that when I started working for health plans about 15 years ago, the average deductible was about $100, $200. Today, the average deductible is $1,500. And if you buy your health insurance through the Obamacare exchanges, you may have a $3,000 or even $5,000 deductible. Well, when the average American can't afford an unplanned $500 expense, how is that affordable health care? And so we think consumers now faced with probably the third biggest expense after buying a car and buying a house, they're going to act more in a retail way, and they're going to be looking for infrastructures, data sets, analytics that help them make their consumer dollar go farther. So kind of with that, I believe that healthcare is a very compelling place to invest, not so much historically, because I recognize all the challenges that health plans created, but looking forward in a value-based world, I think you're going to see the economics, the investment returns begin to move in a direction that looks more like telecom, that looks more like other areas of our economy, because the health plans are finally going to start getting out of the way a little bit and say, if you can create value and you can demonstrate it, we will, instead of being a barrier, we will actually be in a source of assistance to help scale your business and harvest those value and those returns, both for the patients as well as for the health plan.
Great. Thank you very much, all of you. Before we turn it over to questions to the audience, a couple of things that I had to throw out to the panel. Maybe starting with Greg on this one, and if others have comments. So I'm sitting here, there's like 4 or 5 Apple devices up here, right? And Apple is well known for, these devices look nothing like what Apple started doing when Steve Jobs founded it, the original one. There's been a constant innovation there. Healthcare, the innovation seems to be, like with Myriad, more sort of episodic, and the ability to continue to evolve and develop new therapies and new technologies. We see the big pharmaceutical companies just gobbling up other people creating the innovation because they're not doing it. How do you see this as from an investment? Are these you want to only be in the early days and then get the heck out? Or is there something here to where these can be long-term investments, not just?
Yeah, I'll speak to, I think Myriad is a good example of that. In the early days, we were one of the first companies to actually base a business on gene sequencing. It became a very viable business, and in getting in and starting that out, it took a lot of heavy lifting to get it done, but it became very, very profitable. When I was there, our gross margins were they were pharmaceutical-like margins. We had and by the way, there was cost-effectiveness studies done by people outside of Myriad. They're worried that Myriad did this solely on the basis of having patents, but in fact, if you looked at it, our cost of sequencing was the cheapest that was available commercially, and we had to innovate. We had to go faster and do things better, and of course now sequencing. Whole genome sequencing is becoming commonplace. Everybody's going to ultimately have their own genome sequenced. It's going to be interpreted. The big data are going to predominate, and everyone will have it. So I think that there are opportunities. Businesses change over time, but if you have something that's fundamental, that is needed, you have a long period of time over which you can make investments. And things can grow. The market we're looking at, as I mentioned before, 3.8 million women deliver babies. There's 3.8 million women have a single baby they're carrying during pregnancy. That's the target market for our business. That's a big business. And then what you can do, you can add more information over time. As Colin said, as the data become larger, you aggregate the data. You can actually apply machine learning tools to actually even improve the care. We're in the business of information, providing information to the doctor and the patient. I see a very bright future for starting with this basis, but having it transform and become something even bigger and more interesting and more constantly present, more interactive with the patient and making their lives better.
Yeah, I'd say there usually is continuing innovation going on at these companies, but the process of bringing the innovation to market historically has been so broken that that's almost all-consuming, right? So to get this company, like in the case of Greg, what we loved about his business was his first product addressed preterm birth, massive market, emotional issue. I mean, it checked all the boxes in terms of people are really going to want this. But when we looked at the platform he had built, there was a series of products coming behind that. I would say they had value in and of themselves, but I would think of it more almost like an icebreaker, right? The preterm birth issue, that's our icebreaker, and then what can come behind that is a series of additional innovations, which I think at the end of the day will really transform the management of a pregnant woman from something that is kind of very clinical based today and not very anticipatory to something that's much better managed, much lower risk, and create much better outcomes. So the innovation, I think, is ongoing. I mean, you don't stop working on those new products, but the company has to kind of take all its resources and all of its focus on, okay, I've got this thing, now I've got to create the proof and then go engage the health plans. That tends to be all-encompassing and makes it look like they're not innovating as much when in fact they probably are.
Yeah, I would just add quickly, we think this kind of, I totally agree, and we think this sort of plays to our strengths as early stage investors, or at least sets it up nicely for us, because the big, in technology, often people ask, there's a startup doing X, Y, Z, and people say, but wait, couldn't Google do that or Facebook do that? In healthcare, particularly in drug discovery and things that are, sort of traditional data-driven biotech, people don't ask the question of, well, isn't Pfizer going to compete with you? Or, they have focused on commercializing, doing late-stage research from phase 1 or 2 on, commercializing those drugs, rather than doing a lot of the early-stage research. So we think it plays pretty well to allowing startups to be the engine of innovation in discovery, and then, selling those drugs to big pharma companies down the road.
So another thing that maybe touch on is just, I think we're still very much in the early stages of the collection of data and getting data that's of a quality that the algorithms work. You can take specialized situations like Sarah is doing with the blood and a specific problem, where are we on the big data front? Are we nearing a tipping point where we think that there will just be an explosion of this stuff, or are we still far down the road in being able to collect sufficient and high enough quality data? I think the clinical, what was the term I think you used earlier today? It was the clinical grade data.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
one of the problems is in clinical practice, if you look at the data that are recorded, Charles talked about the file cabinet. What is the quality of the data? It's variable right now, and you have difficulties making really good scientifically valid predictions if the data are noisy. And Colin, we had a bit of a discussion before the panel began about how do we increase the quality. I would love to see research grade data generated as a byproduct of clinical practice. If you did that, if we really could do that and enforce standards of what the data mean, and have it universally collected on patients, then the big data, you could apply the big data algorithms to a much cleaner set of data and get better predictions out of it. At the end of the day, being able to use this information, it requires that you don't have garbage in, garbage out, that you have clean data in and best predictions out. It's really a signal to noise question, and you have to have the data. What you characterize as happening in one patient, it can't be different than what you do in another, and then be able to make a prediction about both. So Colin talked about some very important ways of cleaning the messy data up, but at the end of the day, you want to have an engine that can actually operate on clean data as best you can, so that the predictions you make, the insights that you have, the learning that you do over time continuously can be based on something that's real.
Yeah, this is a really thorny problem. And just to maybe give you a little granularity of how thorny it is, when you think about the financial services industry, right, we have checking accounts. And you say a relatively limited number of things about a checking account, but you say those limited things about every checking account. In healthcare, there's almost an infinite number of things I could say about one single patient, but I'm only going to say a very small number of things about any one patient, sparse matrix problem. And so the underlying computing challenges of that is really quite severe. So you have that problem. I think the other big problem you have is the data is all built from a different perspective. So I spent years and years working with claim data. Well, the claim data comes from paying a bill. So the clerk at the physician's office, when they put in the diagnosis codes and the procedure codes and all the things health plans rely on, they're not doing that with a particular amount of care, just get the bill out. And number two, they may be doing it with a bias because they're trying to maximize reimbursement. So I would take that data when I worked at Anthem, and we would try and use it to identify, here's the diabetics we need to focus on, or here's the patients who are at high risk for a hospitalization. So I would take that list, but then we also had doctors who were collaborating with us who had an EMR, and we'd use some of their data to create a similar list. Well, how much overlap was there between the two? Very little. And the reason is that the perspective that the information's being captured changes, and that dramatically changes the output. So right now, we don't have in this country any way of aggregating this information on a meaningful scale and having it rationalized, or people use the word of clinical ontology, but rationalized in a data model that actually reflects the real world aspects of the patient, and then can be used for the research purposes. So there is a huge need for that kind of infrastructure.
Yeah, and I just want to add, pick up on the word you said, Greg, about aggregating. I totally agree with we need to clean up the input of the data, clean up the data at the point of input. I would hope that we don't put that job on physicians, that we build tools that make the physician's job easier, so we're not asking them to but allow them to do their work and have that data be clean at the beginning. I definitely think we need to clean that data even after that, sort of have an engine that cleans it. But I think just the aggregating, I think machine learning models are actually fairly good when they have lots and lots of data, even if it's somewhat messy. It's much better if it's not messy. And I think one of the big problems in healthcare data is it's so fragmented. I think we're sort of kind of desperate to invest in a company that's going to solve this problem, that pulls, how do we get data out of Epic? How do we get data out of all the payers? How do we get data out of all the hospital systems and put it together? Of course, make it as clean as possible, but once you give machine learning a lot of data, it can do some pretty amazing things, but right now, none of those people want to cooperate with each other. I'm exaggerating a little bit.
No, not too much.
Let's try to pull the data together, and that can be a big help.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's turn questions over to the audience.
I have a question about where the hospitals fit into this. As you mentioned, the customer, the first marketing 101 would be, who's your customer? I would think the hospitals would be the customers. Do hospitals have funds that are investing in you? How's the hospital fitting into this equation?
Well, so as an investor, we kind of run away from hospitals as quickly as possible because the focus in the industry right now is to move as much as possible out of the hospital. That said, they are still a major point of emphasis for the delivery of healthcare. And in general, hospitals can be pretty tough to sell to, in part because you have to both sell them and then the hospital's still going to look to be reimbursed. So depending on the nature of the innovation, sure, there's some that are the hospital is your customer. But in general, even if the hospital is your customer, they're still going to need reimbursement from the payer. And so it doesn't enable you to avoid that payer challenge. So I would say the focus for the majority of innovation still has to be the payer, with the hospital in many circumstances being the second point of emphasis if it's an inpatient type of innovation.
Recent announcement from Google, have they just jumped into this whole beta thing, or are they still trying to find better ways of selling me dog food and cat food?
I mean, my perspective is they've taken a few runs at it, right? I mean, everyone remember Google Health from, what was it, a decade ago or so? And there's actually a gentleman who works at Two Sigma who worked very closely on that. You might, people look to them as, they certainly would share the vision that I articulated a minute ago about let's pull data together, let's bring it together. I think their big problem is a trust problem, right? Like there was a survey I saw recently about people asked which company out of Apple, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Facebook would you be comfortable sharing your health data with? And Apple won by a long shot, and all the others were very low. Even Apple, you'd question. So I just think I think they certainly will try. I worry that they will have to really rebuild their reputation and what people think they are trying to do with that data in order to succeed.
By the way, there is a subsidiary, a wholly owned company, Verily, that was created by Google to do healthcare innovation, and clearly they have their eye on this, and they want to bring things to market. Verily's doing all kinds of interesting things relating to healthcare. And I think that there's a recognition of the complexity and what problems can they actually solve. And the answer right now is that nobody's solved all these problems. There are a ton of things to still fix in healthcare, and we've talked about some of the big problems, the comparability of data and so on. Then you get into if you actually are building devices. Some devices, if they're software, some devices will be required to undergo FDA regulation. Others will not. It just depends on what you're doing. So it's going to be. I think it's going to be an area where it's ripe for innovation. There will be creative ways to do it. Being able to aggregate data and really make sense out of it. That's where the world's going to go, and it will get there. It will eventually get there. But I think it's going to be a tortuous path for a little while.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I've gone over and looked at what they're doing in healthcare. It's almost like let's play in the sandbox type of thing, and it isn't rooted in here's the economic challenges of the American healthcare system, and can you create innovations aligned with making that healthcare system better? That's not the thinking. To me, what I've seen is I can do really cool things, and let's figure out if I can find a consumer for it. But it's not, here are the problems we face as a society. How do I solve that? That, to me, I haven't seen from them.
Question back there.
I'm just curious, I mean, given the problems with HIPAA, with privacy, the trust issue, and the issues of the bigger the data set, the more valuable it is, I mean, is there any sort of initiative on the government's part to create basically the standardization of the data, the collection of the data, have depersonalized data that then is open sourced, so the companies that you are funding can run your models and algorithms on this robust data set and actually develop null hypotheses that then they could go test to bring value to the market?
So in the stimulus bill, there was $35-ish billion to transform the American healthcare system into a digital system. And I served on that. There was a federal advisory committee, and I represented the insurance industry. And it gave me a front row seat to how the government tries to work this out. And it was a learning experience. What I noticed was that relatively small interest groups with very niche areas of interest, for some reason it seemed to be a lot of folks from Vermont and Maine, I'm not sure why, but they had such an extreme demand on privacy that they would say things like, I don't even want my doctor having the notes from my previous visit for my next visit, right? And they actually influenced the outcome of the privacy rules. So as a part of that initiative, we created privacy rules that supported the ability to aggregate data through something called the limited data set. And the idea was we'll remove all the quote, facial identifiers and just allow companies such as these to be able to have access to it. And so you know it's the same person, you just don't know who it is. So there have been efforts to go down this path. All of that said, I think the technology was either not ready or not appropriately deployed to support it. So we still have a long way to go there. But people have focused on this issue. They're trying to solve it. But it was a very good lesson for me in the limits of where you want to use government.
Yeah, I'm less optimistic about government as the source, but I do think some of the large hospital systems, like Greg, you were at Kaiser in your early career, is that right?
Intermountain.
Intermountain, right.
Yeah.
I think some of those systems that are that big may have enough data that they could bring it together if they desire to.
I'll also be for the next. I'll add to that. There is no such thing as depersonalized information.
Yeah.
There was a study a few years ago where researchers took 10 anonymous sequenced DNA from 10 individuals, and all they knew was the location of the rough location in the country of the individual, and the age of the individual, and the genome. And they were able to, using public data sources, identify all 10 people based off simply their genome, their age, and their location. So that doesn't exist, basically. But
perhaps to Dr. Kennedy, what we clearly all can conclude the payor is very important in the system, perhaps overlooked. Is there anything, and personally, I don't think of the payors, private payors, as particularly innovative. Is there any innovation that we could see coming from the payors themselves to make the case against the single payor?
Great question. I think that if you look at what United is doing, they haven't been very public, but there's a particular infrastructure they use that I actually rolled it out for Anthem. That is the only system I've ever seen that can take claim and clinical data and put it all into a clinical ontology, a data model consistent with reality, and roll it out there. Actually, they announced this at their, I think, investor conference last December. They're actually deploying all of the people that they have, that they touch or serve. I want to say it's on the order of like 50 million people. It's a massive number. And they're well down that progress. So if you look at their investor conference call, I think it was December of last year, they announced that they were going to do that. I think that could be very disruptive and very interesting. You're seeing, Anthem has a company called HealthCore that we're actually working with. This is a company that does real-world analytic studies, and they're starting to collaborate with companies like Greg and others to find these innovations and then figure out a way to accelerate. So there are some pockets, but I haven't seen a organized, meaningful response to Medicare for All yet from the private payers.
Do you have any other questions? Yeah.
A question for Dr. Kennedy about the cost. You mentioned quite an interesting point that the patients getting involved in cost is a natural way to control costs. I haven't seen in my own personal experience the healthcare cost is huge. You go in with a creepy need, the guy offers an MRI, you think, wow, this machine costs millions of dollars. Why can't I go off peak? There's no off peak, it's 9 to 5. You've got that extra dessert you're looking at, the extra donut maybe. That's probably a $10 donut to the healthcare system. Is there anything that you see that's actually practical where the patients are getting involved in saving the system money and saving themselves money?
So yeah, so the point of emphasizing the increase in the deductible was to say, I think healthcare is moving in the direction of retailization or B2C instead of B2B. So that framework is there. What isn't there is the underlying tools to empower the consumer to act like a rational purchaser of care, just like they do in any other part of the economy. For instance, when you need health care, there's very few places you can go where you know what it's going to cost you before you have it. You know, usually you get the care and then, you know, thus the surprise medical billing legislation you see being talked about. But there are companies, and we're actually focused on this, who are using predictive models to say, well, I can look at your clinical data and I can see that the doctor's scheduling a whatever, a cholecystectomy, whatever it is. I can look at your benefits and I can make an estimation of here's what it's going to cost you at this facility, here's the other alternatives where you could get it more cheaply. Some people call this price transparency, but most of the price transparency tools, I did this back when I was at Anthem, we had multiple price transparency initiatives, and the problem is most of what is done is just here's a static price list, which doesn't empower you. You really need to apply, you know, big data analytics to say here's what this consumer is likely to be able to is likely going to face financially. Here's the most economic place you can get it, and even say to the hospital, they probably can't pay this $1,500. They probably only can pay $500, $600. You know, think about that and make a rational decision before you provide the care. Because another massive problem in healthcare is all of our healthcare hospitals, massive accounts receivables, right, that they can't collect. So there needs to be some kind of a solution to kind of work that out, and that's another area we're focusing on.
So we'll wrap it up. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. Thanks to our panelists. I think this has been very informative and a great view of the healthcare investing frontier. I'll turn it back over to Steve. Yeah.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you, Phil, for putting this whole symposium together. I was a skeptic, and you proved me wrong once again. Thank you very, very much. And while I'm talking, if you would fill out the comment cards, let speakers know how they've done, and also to give us an idea of what you'd like to hear about. And okay, so we're going to meet here next time on January 30th. John's putting together a session on myth busting, taking off on Charles McKay's book, Popular Delusions. And so if you would, perhaps if you could put on your card as well some of the popular delusions or the myths that you see in the marketplace and are operating in, as Soros, what Soros call it, the variant perception. Usually they're behavioral, but even if they're investment, let us know. And John's putting this together. I think you're going to be very pleased. So with that, I also want to thank Ray Gustin and Ryan Dartnell for helping us put this whole thing together. It was a long time coming, and you know, it's really wonderful. I do want to, under the heading of Content is King, I do want to announce again that we do have a YouTube page now. No one knows about it except you. But someone seems to have found it. We have an awful lot of hits for the Jim Simons session, Mathematics and Common Sense. So, and everything else has no hits whatsoever. So I don't know what's going on there, but Anyways, we've got 25 years of content, and it's quite amazing. Okay, so also the Bruce Museum, as you probably heard earlier, some drills happening in the background. We're going to be kicked out of the Bruce Museum in July for a year and a half while they undergo construction. So we will be meeting again at the Historical Society over the Bush Holly House. It's a much smaller room, and so invitations are going to be a little bit tight, but stay tuned. That is about it. And but Joanne reminds me, she's our treasurer. She has this little pillow on her chair that says, "Show me the money." And so she reminds me to make a plea for contributions. Again, we try to keep up our thought leadership. And if you would, it's the end of the year, so don't forget us in your cards and letters. So thank you very much. And once again, Greg, Charles, Colin, very good job. Thank you very, very much.